Thank you so much to the organizers for having me. All right. In her introduction to the Dictionary of Untranslatables, Barbara Cassin accuses analytic philosophy of construing English as the language of common sense and shared experience. That is, a language that serves to give expression to a universal logic underlying language as such. And the aim of this talk is to investigate the pull of this accusation as it relates to Cassin's principal target, and that is the tradition of ordinary language philosophy, which I shall henceforth call OLP. At the outset, let me quote Cassin at length. She writes, "For a certain tendency in analytic philosophy, philosophy relates only to a universal logic, identical in all times and all places, for Aristotle, for my colleague at Oxford. Consequently, the language in which the concept finds its expression, in this case English, matters little." And this first universalist assumption meets up with another. The whole Anglo-Saxon tradition has devoted itself to the exclusion of jargon, of esoteric language, to the puncturing of the windbags of metaphysics. English presents itself, this time in its particularity as a language, as that of common sense and shared experience, including the shared experience of language. The presumption of a rationality that belongs to angels rather than humans, and a militant insistence on ordinary language combine to support a prevalence of English that becomes, in the worst of cases, a refusal of the status of philosophy to continental philosophy, which is mired in the contingencies of history and individual languages. Cassin speaks of analytic philosophy, but the universalist colleague at Oxford we meet in this passage is not just any analytic philosopher. They are rather a placeholder for practitioners of the philosophical school one would paradigmatically associate with mid to late 20th century Oxford, call it linguistic philosophy, Oxford analysis, or ordinary language philosophy. On Cassin's picture, OLP's militant insistence on ordinary language allegedly generalizes its investigations of a single vernacular over language as such. It thereby promotes ordinary English as the source language of universal concepts that in turn are fit for dissolving deep philosophical problems. And the Dictionary of Untranslatables illustrates, by contrast, how a philosophical project may defy such monolingual universalism. That is, the dictionary attempts to map out the ways in which words in different languages constitute the canon of concepts that have found their way through translation into various monolingual encyclopedias of philosophy. And as the dictionary shows, the discipline of philosophy is indebted to a history of translations, drawing its vocabulary from various vernaculars, living or dead, whose linguistic practices have given rise to untranslatables, to words we keep on translating, but whose import won't be captured by those translations in which we employ them today. Now, here's how I want to navigate this topic with regards to OLP in this talk. In order to assess Cassin's accusations against OLP, we'll first have to get clear on how we want to understand OLP as a method for our purposes. And this framing of OLP will lead us as a second step to the question of how to frame Cassin's accusation as it touches OLP. In order to assess Cassin's accusation, I will frame it in terms of a failure to do justice to the linguality of OLP's own observations. What that means is this: OLP fails to appreciate the extent to which a linguistic structure is assignable to a concrete language system, a langue à la Saussure, if you will, all while failing to critically challenge the assumption that these kinds of assignments of linguistic structures to languages will unambiguously be possible. And finally, in a third step, I aim to read these insights on linguality into the method of OLP itself. And what underlies my project here is the assumption that philosophizing from the standpoint of ordinary language use within different speaker communities means charting the conceptual differences between different languages, all while rejecting a picture of languages as monolithic conceptual schemes. In a word, this talk contends that any ordinary language philosophy will have to be an ordinary languages philosophy, one that is situated at the intersections of multiple lingualities. All right, let's start. What is ordinary language philosophy? I want to understand OLP in a way such that exponents of OLP operate along a spectrum between the mid-20th century work of Ludwig Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin. It is quite apparent that Wittgenstein and Austin do not collaborate or openly agree in the methods they propose. However, this talk will necessarily stress their similarities rather than their differences within the project of philosophizing from the starting point of the ordinary use of words. But what is the point of engaging in such a project? Well, there are different routes available here. But I'd like to focus on OLP as a critical project, where any particular appeal to some ordinary use of words gets its point by virtue of the philosophical confusion it serves to point out. And this critical vein of OLP is helpfully illustrated by Wittgenstein's remark in Uncertainty, section 10, that when we are sitting at a sick person's bedside, it's nonsense to assert, I know that a sick man is lying here. I know. What's at stake here is the disparity between the ordinary use of I know and the criteria of employment that the philosophical discipline of epistemology defines for those phrases. Contemporary epistemologists might analyze the concept of knowledge as justified true belief. They might ask whether some knower really knows that they are currently holding up their hand in front of their face, that this red barn is a barn rather than a facade, or that a moral judgment is valid on the basis of someone else's testimony, and so on. And when they do so, according to OLP, these philosophers are attempting to glean something essential to knowledge by reflecting on cases where the word know is, as Wittgenstein puts it, on holiday or idling, like a car engine would. Such philosophical language interferes with ordinary language. It misleads us by seemingly doing important work, yet not being at work at all. And it's not at work because it is not language that has a point by virtue of being employed on a particular occasion, prompted by particular worries and purposes, by some speaker to do some type of work. By highlighting such conditions under which a word is ordinarily used, OLP intends to trouble the prevailing assumption that a particular combination of words can and must make sense simply by virtue of being composed of familiar words that are put together syntactically correctly, and then they take up some kind of relationship to their meaning. Thus, when philosophers asked about some knower in some scenario, whether this is a case of knowing or not, they run the risk of abstracting away from any specific reasons or any specific stakes that any ordinary speaker could have had for caring about the question whether someone really knows something. And this is Wittgenstein's point in criticizing the question of whether I know that there is a sick person lying in the bed beside me. And it is elaborated by Austin in Other Minds. What they're interested in is speakers' competent employment of know and related words against the background that we human speakers are ordinarily fallible. Austin and Wittgenstein don't care about some relation, the relation of knowing, which sometimes simply holds between potential knowers and propositions, irrespective of whatever might move us to put that into words. It should be clear at this point that the critical project enacts a difference between ordinary and philosophical language. And since the latter produces nonsense, the project must be to dissolve the need for talking that way. What we do, writes Wittgenstein, is to bring back words from their metaphysical to their everyday use. And clearly drawing this distinction between philosophical and ordinary language has traditionally been a challenge for OLP. For our purposes, let's distinguish ordinary language from idling language by simply pointing out that for OLP, ordinary language is the public language we employ to articulate shared experience. Thus, fundamentally, there is just ordinary language, language that works and thus helps to draw distinctions, helps us to see the word more clearly. Now, critics of OLP often take the ordinary to mean unreflective, conventional common sense. And that not only rings true with CASSIN'S choice of words, but it has also given rise to well-worn arguments for condemning a parochialism and conservatism that's supposedly bound up with a focus on mere ordinary usage. In an article entitled The Tyranny of Common Sense, for instance, David Papineau reflects that, thankfully, the banalities of ordinary language philosophy are no longer with us, done to death by 1,000 miserable attempts to solve philosophical problems by careful attention to upper middle class English usage. So at this point, let us take a second step and ask, how does CASSIN'S accusation touch OLP? To stick with our example of knowing, if we are concerned with different uses of know, as well as the human needs, interests, and concerns that give rise to these uses and provide their standards of application, OLP will be met with a challenge, and that is how to make any observation about what constitutes an ordinary use, as opposed to idle language, count beyond the scope of a specific speaker community. We may ask here, for example, whether investigations about when we should or shouldn't say no or wissen translate between English and German. And then we might be struck by all the German words that do different types of work, which are all done by varieties of no in English, words such as kennen or können. And even such simple observations should suffice to get a preliminary grip on CASSIN'S accusation. If OLP does not reflect on the relativity of its own investigations to the English language, its claim to examine our ordinary use might only be cashed out as a far more parochial endeavor than it had any ambition to be. Now, granted, using or accusing OLP of centering exclusively around the English language will always seem odd when Wittgenstein has philosophized predominantly and published exclusively in German. There is, of course, something to be said about how the Anglophone context of reception has shaped what we have come to understand as OLP. But let's instead read CASSIN'S critique in the light of a more general failure. OLP is suspected here of failing to appreciate the linguality of its own observations. That is, to put it with Robert Stockhammer, who's coined the term, OLP is suspected of being unaware that we encounter language only in the form of languages, not as language as such, where these languages, however, simultaneously must not be understood as separate individual languages. There's much more to be said about the notion of linguality and its relation to ideals of monolingualism, but suffice it to say here that linguality serves to question the picture on which utterances or other linguistic artifacts belong to a specific language, by way of undermining the underlying picture of a language as a discrete, unified system that is there to enable linguistic interaction strictly within its borders. But now back to OLP. As many will know, part of Austin's project in his lectures on how to do things with words is to pretend to give us a theory of speech acts by way of different distinctions that he subsequently uncovers as untenable. After leaving behind several of these distinctions, such as the initial distinction between constative and performative utterances, we reach the 10th lecture and the end game for the final distinction, illocutionary acts versus perlocutionary acts. Since lecture 2, a certain piece of terminology has been motivating this distinction. Austin writes, we were to consider, you will remember, some cases and senses, only some, heaven help us, in which to say something is to do something, or in which by saying or in saying something, we are doing something. The illocutionary act was always supposed to have a force in saying something, while committing a perlocutionary act is achieving effects by saying something. Now, why is this distinction interesting for our purposes? It is because of how the translators of how to do things with words circle around this central terminology to the best of their language's abilities. Let's take a look at a German and a French translation. What do we see? In a word, while Ghislaine is able to reconstruct the difference between in and by in French, Eike von Savigny has to resort to rather uncommon dadurch construction before introducing the quite extraordinary damit, dass A gesagt hat gebet, to capture the distinction on Austin's part. And this is obviously no distinction that is at home in the German language. Moreover, von Savigny's translator's notes mark almost the complete 10th lecture as text which can't be translated by the German text and is thus altered or left out. Why is this significant? Well, we seem to have here a linguistic intuition whose plausibility wanes when not formulated in English. Yet it is an intuition that is supposed to ground the most significant distinction Austin has left. Illocutionary acts are conventional acts, perlocutionary acts are not conventional. But as Eike von Savigny's editorial choices illustrate, not only is the in saying something by saying something distinction lost in the German language, but the majority of the 10th lecture consists of observations about ordinary English usage in particular that can serve to make the illocution-perlocution distinction plausible in a German translation. So what we have here seems to be a striking example of OLP running up against the linguality or the language relativity of its observations. What Austin tries to make count in English seems to end up as untranslatable, at least into German. What do we make of this? In the final section, I want to suggest that OLP, read as an ordinary languages philosophy, is perfectly capable of fruitfully engaging such multiplicity of languages. An ordinary languages philosophy? Well, reading Austin as a theorist of speech acts might plausibly mean reading him as engaged in the project of identifying underlying linguistic rules, a kind of universal logic that gives rise to linguistic conventions in different speaker communities. What we may do instead, however, is read Austin as investigating conventions of ordinary English language use, not to extrapolate rules from them that are somehow valid for more than a specific linguistic community, but to show how the distinctions they seemingly allow for depend themselves on just those conventions that happen to be in place. Austin's lists of elocutionary forces, the taxonomy he gives us at the end of How to Do Things with Words, is not naively universal in ambition. Rather, it is a list of words we might do things with due to the conventions of the English language, including conventions on whether what we do is conventionally encoded or not. That is, whether it's an elocutionary or perlocutionary act. In a sense, How to Do Things with Words is a manual for speech action within the scope of the English language, negotiating which distinctions may or may not be drawn in English. And far from establishing a primacy of English, the book may be picked up in one of its translations to have different examples, show you what can be done and how it's done. In fact, Austin spends the whole 10th lecture that Eike van Savigny couldn't translate working against the intuition that the in saying something by saying something distinctions could ground the elocution-perlocution distinction. He announces at the outset, will these linguistic formulas provide us with a test for distinguishing elocutionary from perlocutionary acts? They will not. Thus, what Eike van Savigny fails to translate into German is a string of observations about ordinary English language use in particular, which serves to undermine a distinction that would not have done the same job for German in the first place. So what the 10th lecture really shows us then is what makes OLP particularly interesting in the face of translation, provided we don't read OLP as a project of uncovering foundational linguistic rules, a universal logic, that give rise to a set of possible speech acts throughout different languages and linguistic communities. We might say that to translate OLP from one language to another is to trace differences between different sets of abilities to do things with words that is afforded to different speakers by virtue of their situation within different linguistic communities. And on our reading of OLP, where the point of its investigations depends on particular linguistic confusions it seeks to resolve, it's no wonder that some piece of OLP might not be translatable into another language, since its point, the dissolution of a particular confusion, might not be necessary in some languages. At this point, we may circle back to Wittgenstein, who in later manuscripts and typescripts between 1946 and 1947, explicitly appeals to the multilingual situation of the 20th century European speaker. No one in Europe today has only one language, even someone who only knows how to speak a single one, he writes. Vocabularies and ways of speaking have crossed the porous borders from one language to others, ceasing to be clearly assignable to a single one. But our knowledge of different languages, Wittgenstein notes, makes us take less seriously the philosophies embedded in the forms of any one language. In an earlier version of this manuscript, Wittgenstein had complained that our knowing multiple languages makes us underestimate the differences between different languages. He then traces back this underestimation of cross-linguistic difference to the philosopher's tendency to pay attention to a limited selection of aspects from different languages. Thus, even if the languages we look at may be different, even different to such an extent that they would motivate different ways of philosophizing, the philosopher's parochialism in Wittgenstein's science, the parochialism in cherry-picking examples, subverts this multiplicity of languages in favor of attempts to generalize over them. And at this juncture, we may read Wittgenstein as making the point that in ignoring the plurality of linguistic moves we make within a singular language, we are ignoring the ordinary speaker's ability of knowing their way around multiple language games. But rather than emphasizing this intralingual dimension, I want to point out that the multiplicity of languages not only comes with multiple sets of playable language games, but this multiplicity also confronts us with a challenge of relating them to each other. As I want to read Wittgenstein, the multilingual subject he has in mind does not only play language games within the borders of one singular language, rather, we are positioned at the intersection of multiple languages games. And this point, I take it, is illustrated by section 83 of the Philosophical Investigations, where Wittgenstein points us to cases where we play games that aren't bound by predetermined rules, but where we make them up and change them as we go along. He writes, Und gibt es nicht auch den Fall, wo wir spielen und make up the rules as we go along, ja auch den, in welchem wir sie abändern as we go along. And this observation is not to be read merely as a curious, fun case of glottomimesis, that is, of foreign language signifiers appearing in the text. It is rather, I think, exemplifying what it preaches. Speaking a language is a rule-bound activity, yet we are able to change the rules as we go along. That is, someone's linguistic competence is not bound to the rules of a singular language, since multiple sets of linguistic rules may alternate within the scope of one conversation, perhaps even within one person's individual lingual profile. Now, I see this very roughly sketched approach to thinking about the method of OOP as an illustration of how we may take the multiplicity of languages seriously as ordinary languagist philosophers, so as not to fall victim to CASSIN'S accusation. Thank you so much.